This talented author hails from Puerto Rico and is behind Newbery Honor Book Ivali Explains It All and Pura Belpré Honor Book Something Like Home. With a decade of experience as a public school teacher, she is deeply passionate about providing children with diverse and enriching literature. Now based in New Orleans, she crafts children's books that reflect the stories she believes all students should have access to. Let's give a warm welcome to Andrea Beatriz Arango.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us about some of the books that inspired you during your own childhood?
Yeah, I think, it was interesting growing up in PR because I read a lot in Spanish. I went to school in Spanish, but the books in Spanish mostly came from Spain. And then the books that I had in English came from the US. So I didn't really grow up reading a lot of Puerto Rican authors when I was a kid. I think once I got older, like in high school, then we read kind of more like classic literature, and there's definitely like a lot of Puerto Rican authors, but at least at the time when I was a kid, there was just not a lot of like Puerto Rican children's books circulating. And so I really grew up like reading books that did not represent me in any way, in both languages. I think in English especially, I was kind of obsessed with all the series that made it to like my little volunteer run library near my grandparents' house, which was like Nancy Drew and the Babysitters Club and like Sweet Valley Twins and like all those things. And so now I think about it and I look back at stories that I wrote when I was a kid, because I've always written stories. I was always into writing. And I look back at the stories I wrote when I was a kid, and it actually makes me a little sad because I would make a lot of my characters like blonde and they had like American sounding names. And I don't think I did it like consciously, but now as an adult, I'm like, oh, I probably thought that that's what you had to do to publish books, because that's all I was seeing. So I definitely loved reading and I was inspired to write because of all the fun books that I was reading. But it's interesting now as an adult to look back and see how very little of myself I saw represented in those books I was reading.
So did you start to make Puerto Rican children's book because there was a lack of them when you were growing up?
Yeah, so I think when I was a kid, I definitely didn't. All the stories I wrote were kind of like very American sounding, because I read a lot from Spain in Spanish, but that seemed so far away to me. Whereas with Puerto Rico being a US territory, we just had like a lot more US media. So I think I kind of focused on that a little bit more. And I think it really wasn't until I moved to the US in 2014. I was a teacher in Puerto Rico, and then I became a teacher in the Virginia public schools. And really, I started looking for books for my students that represented their own experiences. And that was kind of my like aha moment of like, wait, what about the books that represent my experiences? Like where are those? And I think, now there's a lot of Latinx authors in the US, especially kind of writing stories. I think for similar reasons, because they didn't grow up with as many of them. And now we're just kind of trying to amplify what's out there.
How did your upbringing in Puerto Rico influence your perspective on literature and storytelling?
I grew up with storytelling in both languages, at home and with my family, and at school. I spoke in Spanish, but I still had access to all of this media coming from the US and all those stories in English as well. And so I really did grow up kind of in this like fully bilingual storytelling world. And it just really expanded, I think, my perspectives of how stories can be told and the different ways that different cultures tell stories. I think it all brings in something that feels very me to my stories. I tell kids all the time when I visit schools, like whatever story you're writing is a story only you can write, right? Because we all have completely different upbringings and experiences. And I think for me, that's something that comes out in my stories, even though so far I haven't written a book set in Puerto Rico or with a character who has grown up there. I think the fact that I grew up there makes the Puerto Rican aspects in my books just feel different, because I want them to reflect my experience,
Yeah, feel more authentic.
Mm-hmm.
Your novel, Iveliz, explains it all, tackles important themes such as mental health challenges and finding one's voice in the face of adversity. Can you share with us the inspiration behind the story and how you approach portraying these sensitive topics in a way that resonates with young readers?
I actually started writing that book pretty much when everything closed down, like March 2020. I had been teaching, we all got sent home. We didn't know for how long or what was happening. And so I think I was really thinking about my students' mental health, with them being stuck at home. And specifically because when I was teaching in Virginia, I was teaching English language learners. And so all my students were immigrants and refugees. And a lot of them, their families didn't speak English. And so like online learning especially was like very hard because all the information coming out of the schools was in English. And they just didn't have access to a lot of resources. And so I was thinking about that a lot, about kids not feeling supported. And that's kind of how this book came around, because I wanted to write a story in which the main character, she's surrounded by people who love her very, very much, and adults who really care about her, but they just don't know how to support her in the way that she needs. And I think that's something that a lot of kids can relate to, like sometimes it's the people who love us the most who are unconsciously kind of hurting us by not knowing what to say or do.
Your upcoming third book features a queer main character, and you anticipate potential controversy. How do you anticipate navigate any challenges that may arise from addressing themes that might be considered controversial or lead to censorship?
Yeah, so I think I've been pretty lucky so far, at least that I know of. Neither of my two books so far has been banned. And I think it's because even though they deal with heavy topics, there's nothing super, like controversial in them, at least not when you look at like the current political climate. My third book, it's a book about chronic illness and sports, but it's also kind of a rivals to crushes story. I think a lot of books nowadays, they get banned like solely based on the covers or the descriptions, right? A lot of the times the adults doing the banning haven't necessarily read the books. They don't know how these things are portrayed. And so for us, kind of the direction we're taking it in is if you read the description of the book, it doesn't necessarily say that the main character has a crush on a girl. If you look at the cover, it's not necessarily obvious right off the bat that it's a queer book. And so hopefully that will help a little bit, and that people would have to actually read it. They wouldn't be able to just go based off of the description and the cover. They would have to actually read it to know it was queer. But I'm hopeful that, I'm always hopeful that things will get better, in the children's literature space, and that, all these censorship problems will get better. But yeah, we'll see. That's something that, me and my publisher have had conversations about. And so that was a decision that we made that felt like, because the story really is about Valentina, that's the main character, and the things that she's going through. That's like the main plot point of the story. And so the crush line is kind of like a side plot. And so we were like, you know what? We don't really think we need to include this in the description, especially if it'll unnecessarily, throw the book into some lists maybe that could potentially get it banned.
Finally, how do you hope your books will impact young readers, especially those who may not often see themselves represented in literature?
I started writing in verse, and I started writing like Puerto Rican stories in verse because I read The Poet X. Like that was the first book I had ever read in verse by a Dominican author, which, felt really similar to my culture. And so for me, it took seeing someone else doing it, even as an adult, to think, wait, I want to try doing that too, and then trying it, and it worked out, right? That's the book that got me my agent, got me published. And so I hope that kids reading these books not only feel like someone out there understands what they're going through, and they might get relief, but that they can also see like, oh, I can tell my stories too. I always say my stories are very specific. I'm not trying to do these like big universal stories. Like all my characters have like a ton of things going on at once that feel very individual and might not be relatable to everyone who's reading it. But that's why they're like my unique stories. And I want kids out there to feel like they can tell their unique stories too, and that there will be a home for them, and that some people out there will resonate with them and be really happy they exist.
Thank you so much, Andrea, for sharing your insights and your experiences with us today. It has been truly inspiring to hear about your journey as an author and the meaningful stories you bring to life through your books. Before we wrap up, is there anything you would like to share with our audience?
If you want to write, read a lot. I think for me, that's been the most helpful is just reading all the kinds of stories that are out there. And if you think that maybe you are not at a place yet where like, I think a lot of us feel very like imposter syndrome and like we're not good enough. I just want to remind people like how subjective books are and that there is no book that is like good or bad. It's just what you personally feel about it. And so, you know, my book won a Newbery honor and there's still people out there who hate it, who think it shouldn't have won. Like, it's not the book for them. Right. And that's the case with all books. So I think, if you're watching this and you feel like you want to write and you don't think like your skills are quite there yet, just remind yourself that writing is very, very subjective. And even authors who have won awards, you know, not everyone likes our books. We don't always like our own writing. And so just remember that it's very subjective and personal.
Yeah, going off what you said a bit earlier, I feel like parents should give the book a chance before they just think instantly ban a book just because of something they heard about it, or
Mm-hmm.
like you said, the cover of a book. So it's good that your new queer book actually almost makes you read the actual book before parents can think to actually ban it.
Yeah,
And
that's the hope. I mean, I'm sure some people might be upset or like think that I like trick them into reading something they didn't want to read, but I feel like kids don't usually feel that way. In my second book, there are queer side characters and the main character's therapist uses they them pronouns, and I haven't gotten a lot of backlash from that. And I think it's because it's like 3/4 into the book. So probably, again, it's like you have to actually read the book to see it. And I don't think kids are reading the book and going like, oh my gosh, I got tricked into reading a book that had a queer character, you know? So yeah, I think hopefully it'll help.
yeah, and I think kids are also more curious about the word. I don't think they're thinking about censorship or what should be banned. You know, I
Mhm.
think that's more of the parents, what parents do.
Yeah, more of an adult thing for sure.
And to our audience, make sure to check out Andrea Beatriz Arango latest book and keep an eye out for future projects.
Thank
That's it.
you.
Thank you for today. See you.
Thank you.
Have a good
Bye.
day.